Healthcare, Medio IGC 202, Unit 5. I'm Dr. Isabel Souza, your presenter for these slides. Let's get to a topic that's a love of mine, cultural diversity in healthcare. We're all diverse, and obvious manifestations of that would be race, religion, ethnicity, which is not the same as race, national origin, and gender. Now, just a quick point on the ethnicity and race issue. People get very confused with this because we have the tendency to talk about ethnicity and race as the same thing. It can get confusing because you may have, the Asian race, and Asia is a locality, or it can also be an ethnicity. However, Hispanic is really an ethnicity, not a race. You can have Hispanics that are white, black, Asian, or even Native as well, or indigenous. So all those things can get a little confusing, and it's important for us to think about them in the correct way. National origin, I'll just mention one quick thing. A lot of times any discrimination against national origin can be manifested through lack of language services. But the reality is that we're all completely diverse and we're all unique. But these are just some of the things we can see that are obvious. So let's move on and talk a little bit about how is cultural diversity within healthcare. Well, culture, if we think of its definition, it's the sum total of one's way of living, including values, beliefs, standards, language, thinking patterns, behavioral norms, communication styles, etc. Culture really guides the decisions and actions of a group through time, and sometimes it even guides us in a subconscious way. So, we're all humans, we're all part of groups, and every person that has any kind of belief or standard, it's coming from somewhere, and that's the culture. We also many times talk about cultural background and cultural diversity interchangeably. Let's go on to the next slide. And we'll see that in healthcare, it can be quite prominent. And why? These are some of the expressions of culture in healthcare. First of all, in addition to healthcare these days having a strong diversity of individuals, some hospitals look like the United Nations, they're so diverse. But healthcare also has its own culture. But when you think about how culture affects healthcare, we can have different healthcare belief systems just based on our own cultural background. So some individuals will define and categorize health and illness differently. They'll even offer explanatory models for illness that are different. And I'll give some examples. And, you have to think of many of these are based on theories of the relationship of cause and nature of the illness and treatments. And there are different definitions of the scope of practice for healers. So, it's not, when we say health, everybody has a different picture of what that is. And that's because we have a different cultural background that may affect what we consider health to be, or healthcare. So someone coming from an Asian, culture may think of health in a very different way than Western culture will think of health. There are different modalities of healing and scopes of practice that are different in the Eastern world and the West. And now we're seeing both in both sides, but everybody will have their own way of looking at health. And that comes into play when we start interpreting in different interactions. Let's go on to the next slide. The culture of Western medicine. And this is good because this is what we, the environment that we're working in. And this is the cultural makeup, if you will, of the healthcare system we're working in. So I'm going to, mention a couple of the characteristics of our Western medicine culture. The first one is meliorism. That's making it better. And what that means is there's a value placed in improvement, in perfecting, in making things better or building them. That's not necessarily a value in every cultural framework. The next one is dominance over nature, taking control. And that's a very strong value that we have. And almost as if man-made is better than nature-made, and taking control of any situation. And that will affect how Western healers or Western doctors will look at an issue and they will attack it. If there's a disease, they're going to take control over that disease. They look at the disease as the enemy. So dominance, it's either you get dominated by the disease or you will, either you dominate it or you will get dominated. So it's a real way of looking at illness and looking at healing. Activism, meaning, we're in a just do it culture, right? And doing is much more valued than being. So we have to see how that comes into the play of the culture of healthcare. Timeliness is also another very important value in the Western system, in the US more than anywhere. Time is money. The more that you can do, the better, sooner than later. And these are values that permeate through everything that's being done in our working environment. Therapeutic aggressiveness, stronger is better. So it comes from that dominance over nature. It's also the idea that, a bigger dose will be stronger, therefore will attack the disease in a more effective way. And that's, Western medicine. You'll have homeopathic medicine has a different take on that. Future orientation, plan, the whole concept of having a treatment plan, of looking into the future, of addressing something before it becomes a big problem. Also, newer is better. The newer technology has got to be better than the last technology. The new medication has got to be better than the old medication. So there's this value of newness, and that comes from a consumer-oriented society. Standardization. That really comes from the ethical tenet that I've been talking about in previous units, where we treat all patients the same. Well, we also treat disease in a similar way. And the whole premise of Western medicine research is based on giving the exact same treatment to a certain number of individuals, and then comparing that to, controlling for the environment. So they're all connected, but hopefully this helps explain some of the concepts that are really an underlying framework in healthcare. Let's move on to the next slide here. And here you can, we can compare two different viewpoints, okay? So, one of it is it's ours, and the other one others, or making it better, controlling over nature, doing something, acting on it instead of waiting, intervening now, strong measures, planning ahead, recent is best, standardized, treat everyone the same. And then if you look at the other side of things, some cultural groups will really have a different way of looking at it, or anyone for that matter may end up in one of these two scenarios, but accepting things with grace, balancing, harmony with nature. So the whole concept of balance is different from that control over nature. Waiting and see, sometimes anything precipitous might actually have a negative effect. So timing can be everything. A cautious deliberation, a gentle approach, taking life as it comes. Time is being honored in that way. And individualizing, recognizing the differences. So you see how these can be different approaches. And going back to that one slide we talked about non-judgmental, as interpreters, we're here to really understand the different ways of looking at things. And while we may agree or not with one or the other in different areas, just the ability to look at them and say, well, they're both valid in different situations, and having a neutral approach to looking at some of these differences. That's one of the, important characteristics of being culturally competent. Let's go on to the next one. So what's the definition of cultural competence, right? I gave you just an example of one of the mindsets, but it's really a set of congruent behaviors, practices, attitudes, and policies that come together in a system or an agency or among professionals, enabling effective work to be done in cross-cultural situations. And this is the environment we work in. All interpreters will always be working with individuals of different cultural backgrounds. We'll be working in a specific cultural environment, which is the Western healthcare environment, if you're working in the US. And we will be, working with individual cultural frameworks as well. And when we talk about having cultural competence, we're really talking about not just having a neutral stance, that's really an attitude, but hopefully working in a place which has policies that, respect cultural diversity, policies that acknowledge. One of the behaviors is inclusion. So including, not being judgmental, keeping our personal opinions behind and being able to see multiple perspectives. And practices, we'll talk about some of the practices we can do, but certainly something I hadn't mentioned before, even when we introduce ourselves to two parties, introducing ourselves in a culturally appropriate way to each party. So it might be different with one individual to the next, but just having everyone's cultural preferences in mind when we're doing something as simple as introducing ourselves. So let's go to the next slide. So there's something called a cultural competence continuum. And that is primarily because cultural competence is something that is never completely attained. And even the word competence is sort of shifting now because it might give the impression that, you have it or you don't. But think about, where am I now and where could I be? In order to know where you stand in cultural competence, first of all, you have to do a self-assessment. And how do you do that? Well, the first thing you do is there are different exercises. You can start writing some of your values. Even a simple pie chart where you have, your profession, your cultural background, your family makeup, your educational background, maybe you're a parent and that's a big role in your life. Maybe you're an only child, whatever, some big characteristics. And just by looking at them, you can start seeing, individuals with these same characteristics are the ones I'm going to feel closest to. And they might have some similar belief systems to mine. And folks that are very different from my makeup may have, maybe a little bit more different and have different perspectives. So one thing I have to be mindful is, if I'm an urban interpreter who has, very high education, and I'm interpreting for a patient who has always lived in a rural area and can barely read or write, how is that difference affecting me? Am I respectful of all these differences, or am I looking down on certain differences? So these are things that we have to actually look at, because where we are is just, a lot of times it's subconscious. So these exercises can be very, very beneficial to you. So I want you to think about that. And then where could I be? You know, you'll be different in 10 years for sure. You maybe by then, you know, you'll become a grandparent, or you'll have a bunch of kids, or you'll live in the rural area, whatever. Those changes will create different cultural perspectives, and our own cultural makeup will be different. So think about where you are in the continuum that we're going to talk about next, and how you can always improve and move forward. So this is the cultural competence continuum. And as you can see, you know, the first ones are a bit negative in the sense of effectiveness and ability to work with different individuals of different cultural makeups. And it starts with cultural destructiveness. That's the individual who will look down upon the differences. So if I'm, you know, a person that is religious, and religion, you know, Christianity is important in my life, and I am completely against abortions, I might have a very destructive view of those that commit abortions or make those decisions. So every time we're looking down on anybody else who makes a different decision, that's a destructive behavior, and it will show in the tone, in our body language. So we have to really get rid of that, because it doesn't serve us well if we're going to work in an environment that's culturally diverse. Cultural incapacity is a bit of a it's before blindness, but it's this, you know, incapacity to deal with folks that are different. And it's, you know, there's a lot of fear involved, and a lot of just inability, and the belief that I just can't handle people like this, or I just can't understand this way of thinking. And so it's a block that needs to really be taken care of, and it's fear-based. And the only way to get rid of that is actually by learning about different cultures and trying to listen to the other perspectives, but having a willingness. The incapacity has there's a lack of willingness. The cultural blindness, you know, we're getting to more the middle ground here, but cultural blindness is a bit of a denial. It's an attitude of denial. Well, you know, everybody is the same. We're all humans. Race doesn't matter, which obviously it doesn't if you aren't a racist, but you can't pretend the world doesn't have racism. So blindness is a bit of, you know, whitewashing, or washing everything as if, you know, everyone needs to think the same. Cultural pre-competence is, okay, it's a little bit above blindness. Now you can see the differences. You're trying to learn about these differences, but you're not quite sure how to handle them and how to interact with folks in a way that's really effective. So that's just the beginning of awareness. You know, this all started with cultural awareness, actually. That was the first thing everybody talked about, because that in itself was a big issue back in the day. So believe it or not, you know, that stage was considered, you know, having achieved something, when really it was just the beginning. Awareness is just the beginning of an improvement. You have to be aware you have an issue before you can improve it. So we've moved from pre-competence to cultural competence, and cultural competence, you know, is more about, okay, I'm learning about certain differences of opinion. I'm learning not to prejudge or assume that because this person is Asian and I have learned these issues about Asians or Native Americans or Blacks or whatever group, or even doctors, because I've learned this, now that means they're all the same. So it goes beyond that. It really goes into not just the learning, which is the pre-competence, where you can start making a lot of mistakes by stereotyping, but the competence adds that level of, you know, non-stereotyping, learning how to understand the possibilities, and learning that this individual may, you know, tend to go this way or that way regarding this decision making, or regarding child rearing, or any other aspect of life. but not making the assumption that that is the case. And as interpreters, we need to be at least at that level, cultural competence, because even when we think we know a cultural difference, we need to confirm it. We need to really not make the assumption that it's always the case, because it might be something else. And from cultural competence now, we have cultural proficiency, which is a bit of a higher level, and it's really an individual who's able to, who's proficient at it, who can be at ease, not just knows what needs to be known and how to act, but actually can interact and resolve cultural issues without getting overly involved or take sides. And it's an individual who really has that cultural ability to see all the different sides and be more neutral in their approach. Now, people are starting to talk about cultural intelligence and looking at it from that perspective as well, because, you know, these are the more positive ways of looking at it. There's also another term used, and that's cultural humility. And that term is used mostly to ensure, you know, that respect is at the foundation of how we handle intercultural differences, and also to remind us that we never really attain complete cultural competence. Until the day we die, we're going to be learning how to interact more appropriately, more respectfully, and more effectively with individuals of different cultures. And as interpreters, we're doing more than that, because not only we're interacting with our clients, with patients and providers and family members in a culturally appropriate manner, but we're also, you know, mediating cultural differences. In order to do that, we need to be at a higher level of cultural proficiency. So I hope this gives you a little bit of an idea of the stages people go through. So think about, you know, not only where your cultural makeup is, but also where you're at this particular spectrum. And if you haven't heard of this before, you know, read more about it and definitely look into growing into, the only way to do this is through practice, but through a lot of reading and looking at, you know, any information that really helps you figure out different ways to connect with people and to respect them. So let's move on to the next one. I've already talked about some of these, but this is great because now you're going to have this in writing and you're going to have a few different characteristics. So the destructiveness is, you know, forced assimilation is one of those. When we have this idea that either we have to assimilate or, you know, which is basically denying our cultural makeup in order to fit in. That's a very survival mode type of mentality. Subjugation, when we're forced, you know, and feel subjugated, and that creates an ill will or an ill feeling towards the majority culture. So the rights and privileges for dominant groups only are the ones that are believed in, and we see that in whitewashing of TV shows and even the Oscars. I mean, it's still, there are many areas in our society where we need to leave this particular stage. Cultural incapacity. So here we're talking about this continuum more in a systemic way. So racism, the incapacity to agree or believe that others are like us in every way and require respect. The stereotyping, in this case, you know, it can be pretty negative. Unfair hiring practices. I mean, cultural incapacity is seen in so many ways. And even children in school might feel that they need to conform. And anytime we're trying to conform, we're basically saying that one way is worse than another way, and that there is a way to follow. The blindness, the difference is ignored, you know, treat everyone the same, all lives matter. Of course they do, but it doesn't take away the Black Lives Matter, for example. So this idea that, the dominant groups are the only groups. Let's go on to the next one. See a little bit different wording for this. Pre-competence, awareness, exploring cultural issues, being committed to that, assessing the needs of an organization and individuals. So it's that awareness perspective. Now you can see, and that's truly a big step for many people. Cultural competence, recognizing individual and cultural differences, seeking advice from different groups, hiring culturally unbiased staff. So here it's realizing that, culture is an individual issue, not a group issue only. Although we speak a lot of it in groups, the reality is that within a group, every individual will differ somewhat and might belong to many groups. So let's not shove people into a group pattern, but really understand that they belong to many groups, and because of that, they may have certain beliefs, but because of other groups, they might, differ in some way. Cultural proficiency, implementing the changes to improve the services based upon cultural needs, doing research and teaching. And many, many healthcare organizations have become more culturally and linguistically appropriate simply by virtue of the class standards that we've mentioned, and they've really made and attempted to change things as simple as signage in hospitals, forms, consent forms now are being translated. Now many translations are in bilingual format, so you have both languages in the same document, so the provider can scroll down his side of the paper and the patient can know what they're talking about. So, there's just always something else we can do to improve it. As interpreters, we can see a lot of those possibilities, and staff interpreters usually do get into improving the cultural appropriateness of their institutions. So here we're going to talk about, as I mentioned before, everything starts with awareness. And do become more aware, not just of what you know, because obviously you know something about these differences, but start looking at different frameworks of explaining cultural difference. People who value time, people who value decision making in a group or individually. There's so many different ways of looking at cultural differences. It grows with knowledge, and that's, the more reading you do, the better. And it can be enhanced with specific skills. And those skills usually are tips of how to greet individuals. We're breaking patterns of mistrust. Usually when there's an issue of cultural difference, there's the problem of mistrust. So as we're doing small things to show, basically we're showing goodwill towards another individual from another culture, and that goes a long way. Acquiring cultural competence is a lifelong pattern. So you're going to start here and going to continue, because it's a huge part of what we do. I mean, interpreters in a way are cultural competence agents, because it's through our work that healthcare providers become more competent in understanding the cultural groups we interpret for, and it's through our work that patients can get a little bit more familiar with the Western healthcare system, and also understand why it is doctors ask certain questions and why it is that this is being requested of them. It gets polished through practice. So every single interaction you have is going to be an intercultural interaction. You could argue that any interaction is intercultural, because nobody has the exact same cultural background. However, we actually interpret for individuals that have, bigger differences, because there's a level of unfamiliarity. Otherwise, they would speak each other's language. And some interpreters have a bigger cultural gap to fill than others, Because if you're interpreting between Spanish and English, frankly, the cultural gap isn't as big as if you're interpreting for an indigenous individual and, a U.S. healthcare system, or if you're, interpreting an Asian for an Asian patient from a rural area who's an elderly, so that the age also affects that. So these are all the situations that affect it. And let's look at this explanatory model. This is by Arthur Kleinman, and Dr. Kleinman came up with a very culturally sensitive approach to asking and inquiring about a health problem. And it's beautiful because it doesn't assume, what disease did you come here for? It really, these questions are more open-ended, which allow for the patient to really answer in a more culturally sensitive way. So what do you call your problem? What do you think caused your problem? Why do you think it started when it did? So these first three, I'll address the first three first and move on. What do you call your problem? As you can see here, he's not calling it a disease or ailment. He's not assuming anything. He's letting the patient describe the issue, and also asking the patient to name it in whatever way the patient feels comfortable doing it. What do you think caused your problem? Again, some cultural groups really have a whole list of possible causes to ailments and conditions they may be feeling. And it's important to hear that, because as you hear what they think, they really are able to discuss it in the way they know best. And they are the experts of their own bodies, of their own cultural frameworks, and they should explain it the way they wish. So some cultures really think stress, or, individuals that are, have ill will against them cannot actually cause an ailment. So it's important to hear from the patient, what is it that they think caused the issue? Or they may have a very, westernized way of looking at it and say, I was in a home and my child got sick, and that's how I got sick. Now, why do you think it started when it did? So that comes to the issue of timing. And what does your sickness do to you? How does it work? How severe is it? How long do you think you will have it? So these are all questions really asking the patient to describe everything that they can say about what they have. Even, how long they think they'll have it, how severe it is. And this explanatory model is really, it's called that because it's asking the patient to explain. It's a very different model for the typical Q&A of basically cutting off possibilities, which is one of the questioning systems that many doctors are trained in. It's basically, let's root out these issues by asking these questions. Okay, now you rooted out these issues. Now we're going to ask a few more questions, and this is how, it's by elimination basically that they get to the diagnosis. That's one way of doing it. And this is another model where you're really getting the full picture. It's a more holistic model, and it does seem a bit more culturally sensitive because you will get very different responses from individuals with different cultures. So we're going to end our unit here, and I thank you very much for listening.